Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Today we are going to dive into 3 conversations leaders avoid but shouldn't. First up, how did I learn this lesson? A variety of situations. One, kind of growing up in a top-down or command and control environment and seeing kind of both sides of the coin. I definitely saw some difficult conversations being had, and I also saw some difficult conversations being avoided. So one of the probably most challenging conversations I saw being had, this was way back in the day when I worked for my parents, and they owned a printing company, and my dad's sister, so my aunt, was also an employee there. And one day, for who knows what reason, she did something that really crossed the line. And I don't want to get into specifics of what it was. It didn't put anybody at risk. It didn't harm anybody. But it was a situation that needed to be dealt with. It needed to be addressed. And it was a really difficult conversation, obviously because it was family, obviously because it impacted other people. And ultimately, I saw my dad have to let his sister go, right? So that's the short version of the story in terms of difficult conversations I did see happen. And throughout my career, myself included, I avoided a bunch of these types of conversations because they're uncomfortable. Sometimes you feel as though, well, I've already said these things, and so, why do I need to say it again? It should be obvious to people. Those are some of the reasons, that I would say I've avoided some of these conversations in the past. And all the way up through lately, these last few weeks, it's kind of been an interesting theme throughout the conversations I've been having. And that's not just with clients, it's with, prospects and just general conversation. So this is something that everybody can continue to improve on. It takes practice. One of the things that I had to learn in my kind of leadership journey was to show up with empathy in these conversations and, be matter of fact, state, kind of the situation, give grace and, show up with empathy. But at the end of the day, if you really want to build sustainable growth, right, this is stuff that you can't avoid doing. So, let's dive in. So 3, there's obviously a ton of these, right? But I tried to put these into buckets that made the most sense and the ones that I see, I would say, most often. So first and foremost, you're not meeting expectations. Again, a lot of times with this conversation specifically, we kind of feel as though, maybe we've danced around the issue, maybe we've dropped some clues or dropped some hints, have, talked about some things that are maybe not working out. But again, there is no substitution for clarity in this scenario. The other part of this I've found is that sometimes, the expectations just from a kind of holistic perspective, right, they're just not clear. You're not clear on them, so it makes it challenging to be consistent, from a leadership perspective. Team members, obviously, if that's the scenario, obviously, struggle to understand, like, hey, what's expected? So that's where all of this starts. And again, the other, kind of feeling that some leaders have is, I don't want to be, too hard on this person. They do a good job, here and there, and, they've definitely contributed over the course of time, and they're, have a lot of industry experience or whatever the scenario is. But at the end of the day, you recognize that, they're not quite where you need to be, right? So again, having this conversation, setting up what those expectations are. So a few different ways that you can have better, you're not meeting expectation conversations. First and foremost, you have to focus on, specific behaviors, right? Or missed outcomes. So again, back to that clarity piece. That's probably the biggest gap, right? How do we know what we need, right? What does success look like? So defining those, obviously getting people up to speed on that, but then, if and when they're missing those outcomes, getting specific on exactly what outcomes you're expecting and where that gap ultimately is, right? So again, define what success looks like in plain language. Have specific metrics or KPIs that these folks can contribute to, and that they understand where they come from, right? So you don't want something really difficult to not only measure, but for somebody else to understand, like, well, where did this even come from? It just feels super arbitrary to people. Again, here's the kind of, showing up with empathy, right? Like, offer support, but be clear, right? Like on what needs to change and by when, right? So sometimes we have these conversations and kind of in our, in our kind of angst about having them and wanting to get out of them as quickly as we can, sometimes we gloss over this stuff and, we kind of have the conversation, but we don't set clear expectations in terms of, what are we going to do next, right? What's the next time frame? Like, how long do you have to improve? Like, all of those things. So you're left with even more confusion around, maybe now I know I'm not, doing what I'm supposed to do, but what does that really mean? Like, is my job at risk? Is, all of the other flood of questions that are out there. So you have to be prepared with that, right? So again, offer support, but be clear on what the gap is and how that person can close the gap, and again, by when. So as a final wrap up to these conversations, one of the things that I learned, and I always have to remind myself to rephrase this, right? But one of the things I had learned is, does this make sense, right? So again, checking to confirm that, the person understands what you're saying. So while that one's an easy one for me to always remember, like, oh, does this make sense? Another, kind of thing that I had picked up is that sometimes that comes across either too confrontational or it makes people not, open up and say, well, I have a question about this, because people don't want to look like, like they don't understand what you're saying, right? So it's like, try to rephrase that to, do you have any questions? Is there anything else that I can clarify? Instead of the, does this make sense? So that's another way to kind of close that out. And again, kind of, ensure, like, the best way to say is kind of like ensure compliance, right? Like, you understand that there's a gap. Here's how the gap needs to be closed, and by when, right? So here's how we can close the gap of missing expectation. So second conversation that is a bit of an extension of you're missing, expectations, or you're not meeting expectations, but, the role is no longer a fit. Again, sometimes I think people jump right to this when we've not clearly articulated what the expectations are to begin with. I've got a client in a situation where they've got somebody with a lot of industry experience. They were responsible from a leadership perspective, but they weren't really executing on their kind of role and responsibilities. So naturally, first question, like, do they know what's expected? It's like, well, yeah. And, it's obvious. And do you have a job description? Kind of, so you start to unpack those things and you start to understand, like, well, we've not been really clear with this person in terms of what the expectations are. So let's go ahead and do that, right? what does success look like? All these types of things. So that's kind of first conversation. Now, as it starts to roll into the, this role may no longer be a fit, we're kind of exposing those gaps from a skill set perspective. Now, again, there's kind of two different ways to look at this, right? Like either the role has expanded or kind of outgrown the skill set for the person, right? Or like something else has changed with that individual, and there doesn't seem to be like a pathway forward for that, right? So it's less about the it's less about trying to maybe upskill somebody, and more about saying like, or I should say this a different way. It's less about diminishing that person's abilities and the need for upskilling, versus saying like this role, we're kind of clearly defining what this role is and what we need for this role. So again, another example, different client, similar position in terms of a leadership role, and this person's skill set and comfort level, I should say. So it's not just a skill issue; it's a comfort level, and I want to do this, I want to grow, I want to expand. In this situation, this person really doesn't. They're comfortable with where they're at. They have a certain skill set, but all that said, they have deep level industry and company experience. So it's like, you don't want to lose that, right? So in that scenario where it's like this role may no longer be a fit, it's because, we're now clearly defining what this role is and what we need from this role in order for our entire organization to be successful. And when that's not clearly defined, it's easy to kind of say like, yeah, so-and-so isn't doing this or not doing this or not doing that. So maybe that's the not meeting expectations. But what we're really saying is like, we haven't clearly defined what this role is. And therefore, we're kind of allowing somebody to just kind of contribute whatever they deem they can contribute without any sort of, goal and bounds, right? Makes it really challenging on both sides too, right? Like this is challenging for people to deal with and navigate, because they sense, like the inconsistency with which you're kind of holding people accountable, right? So it's like one day you might, get irritated and kind of go off the rails, right? And then like the next day it's like, same situation and everything's fine. So again, this conversation here is a bit more complex, but, similarly, right? Focusing on the needs of the role, not the worth of the person, right? So again, it's one thing if people want to get upskilled and they also have the kind of hunger to be able to do that. It's another thing to kind of just recognize that, this role has kind of outgrown, the specific person, and we are, kind of not able to upskill in a period of time that makes sense to keep this person in that role. So be clear on, the gaps that exist, and more importantly, why they matter now, right? Because again, that's going to be a question people have, like my one client, I made the comment about that is, now clearly defining what is expected for this particular role. And there is a gap in skill set and a gap in, hey, I really want to upskill myself and do this job. Well, why does it matter now? Like I've been doing this for so long, right? So being able to articulate to people, why the structure, why the clarity, why are we working on this stuff now, and how that ultimately contributes to the greater vision, the bigger picture, right? However you want to say that. Acknowledging, the people that we're kind of in this conversation with, right? Acknowledging their contributions, the impact that they've had, on the team, on the organization. Again, this isn't to diminish people's skills, the need to upskill. It's not even to say like, hey, if you really don't want to do this, there's nothing wrong with that, right? It doesn't mean you're not valuable to the team. It doesn't mean that, we can't find a spot for you somewhere on the bench. It just means that this role that we maybe had you in by title no longer makes sense for the vision of the organization, right? Kind of, it's as simple as that. Obviously, some nuances I just unpacked. So, third and kind of, final, but also a definitely not final. I shouldn't have said that. Third kind of example, let's say, of difficult conversations that we avoid. And this one's a bit bigger and broad, but I thought it was important to bring it up here again. But it's like, what's changing and why? So I've talked about this through a few different lenses in terms of, specific initiatives, like how do you get buy-in and, participation from people, right? But sometimes, and again, depending on org structure, right? So I'll back up a little bit. I kind of grew up in a company that I was in a middle management layer. So while I had, P&L responsibility, I was still technically in that middle management layer where I had, executives above me, the board above them. And, then I had our entire team, right? And so as that expanded, or as I was, brought into other facilities and parts of the organization, kind of all of those layers still existed. So sometimes, I was told things would be changing, right? So that put me in my position in kind of this, weird place of change, right? It's like there's not really this idea kind of, ideation phase, right? It's kind of like, hey, we're doing this. So now I had to shift into the, like, what's changing and then why, right? So I had to tie all of that together for the team and then look for the opportunities to bring in the how in some cases. In other cases, the how was told to me as well, right? So, your organization may be different. If you're a business owner, obviously, you're good chances you're at the top of the list, right? So you maybe aren't dealing with this. You may be telling, your ops leadership folks, you may be the one that's kind of generating this, and they're the ones kind of having to live in that middle life, dealing with the change, dealing with the folks out on the floor, or, doing the work and get everybody together, right? So it's like, that's the reason I wanted to bring up this specific conversation, because regardless of where you're at in the org, and regardless of, kind of what participation level, right? It's like, change is hard. So you have to make sure that people don't feel blindsided by it. You have to bring people along in the conversation. And for me, that always starts with, the why, right? So even when I was being told, hey, we have to, roll out this new tool. Why? What's wrong with the one that we're already utilizing, right? And so asking those questions. So, asking the questions or sharing that why kind of early and often is the best way to make sure that people, don't feel blindsided in some sort of change scenario. The other thing that I've found, and again, this is something I've talked about and have experienced personally, is, because in the leadership kind of level, you're used to just dealing with problems and, constantly shuffling the deck and prioritizing and looking for opportunities and options to solve specific problems. It's always on your mind, right? So like one of the things I used to do, and kind of the way that I learned this whole lesson about, the why, the what, and the how is, it'd be on my mind that I would I knew the why and the what, and I would jump right to the how, because I've already looked at all these different options. I've kind of weighed the pros and cons. In some cases it was, had to do with, capital expenditure approvals and other, decision trees that I was, ultimately reporting up through. But that's what happened, right? A lot of times it was just I was kind of holding off on, going through the why and the what, because I already knew what, how I wanted to get this thing done. And then it was just a matter of rolling out the change. So I really stumbled in a lot of cases with sustained change because, I didn't bring people along in the journey, right? I didn't talk about why we need to do this. So thankfully, I learned that lesson probably later than I would have liked looking back. But, that's the best lessons that get learned, are the hard ones. And then you've got the stories to share with other folks about them. The other thing that would happen and that I saw, and again, this was kind of beyond twofold, right? One, it was beyond my control. I didn't have the ability to make a different decision. And two, it was after I'd learned these lessons about, the why and the what. So I kind of saw, the light at the end of the tunnel was the train, right? And I'll dive a bit deeper into what I'm talking about. So there was a situation. This was back in the day for a facility I was responsible for that we were ultimately having to relocate, right? And so in that process, we had lots of conversations with the executive team, executive leadership about, how this kind of was all going to happen, if we we're going to offer folks transfer roles, other positions, all these different aspects, right? One of the things that had come up is, we kind of got to get ahead of this, right? Like we have to let people know what's going on. Because if we don't let people know what's going on, people are going to feel blindsided, and it's just going to be kind of a giant shit show that we're going to have to try to recover from. And the decision was made, let's kind of keep things under wraps. Let's do it quietly. Let's do it slowly until we kind of have to, because we don't want to create panic, right? So that was the thought process, don't create panic around change. And this was a major change, right? It was a major change internally. It was a major change externally. And so it's this idea of, we don't want to share anything until everything is final, because people are going to have, a plethora of questions that we don't have answers for. And so the big takeaway out of all of this, right? And you can imagine how all of this rolled out and, kind of the disruption that it ultimately caused. But the takeaway is this, right? It's okay to not have all of the answers. That doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about what's changing, and why, right? Because again, when you share the what's changing and why, you can then say, I don't have all of the answers. We're navigating this thing in real time. Here's what we think is going to happen. Here's what we think, here's how we're preparing, for all of these things to kind of unfold. Here's what we know to be true based on, other examples, history, blah, 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 right? But what you don't want to do is avoid the whole thing and spring it on people, because that creates real chaos. And depending on, how big of a change this thing is, it can impact your business, right? Not just internally from a turnover or, kind of chaos perspective, but externally, right? Customers could kind of leave in droves. Customers may hold back orders. Customers, may reach out 100 times to, get an update on their their in-process work. It's just all kinds of different things that really could just be avoided by having some difficult conversations and being upfront about it, right? We don't have all the answers. So again, talk about the why early and often, share what you know, but more importantly, right, share what you don't. And what I love to say, again, hard lesson I learned, right? No update is still an update, right? Hey, this isn't off the radar. This isn't the flavor of the month, type of scenario. It's we just haven't made any additional progress, kind of no new news to share. Right. So all of that makes things, much more palatable to people. Again, internally, externally, that side of it doesn't matter. Right. And again, if possible, right, this isn't always going to be possible, but if possible, get more people involved, because the more people that are involved, the easier that kind of articulation and communication flow can happen. So, yeah, I think most people do their best to have these conversations at some sort of level, or believe that they've had these conversations at some sort of level. the reality, I would say, after, now nearly 30 years of, leading people, is that we all can brush up on our skills with this stuff, because every conversation, the specifics within it, the emotions and dynamics of the relationships and the people involved in them, all of that stuff is always changing. So, not to say you need to seek difficult conversations, but the best leaders that I know have difficult conversations more regularly than any other conversation. So it's the conversations that keep your org growing, that keep your org informed, that keep people engaged in what's happening. And those are some of the things that, contribute to a culture of continuous improvement and, ultimately sustainable growth. So as a reminder, the solo episodes of the podcast are an extension of our weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. All of this stuff we put out for free. And so I'd encourage you to go to the website and subscribe to that if you're not already. As always, appreciate you tuning in, and catch you on the next episode. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.